back in.
Yes.
You and some of your friends have come along here before.
Yep.
So tell me, how did you get so excited about ferns? Where did your fern interest start?
I suppose it started about 18 years ago when I lived on the west coast. For about 12 years I lived on the coast, and we just had a period where we had a gold mine come through our community in Charleston and do a whole lot of gold mining, and what they were doing essentially was stripping off the fauna, or the flora I should say, and then they were mining. So we thought, well, how can we get in, what can we do about this? And the only thing we could do really was get in and dig some of the plants, and there was a real concentration of ferns, so we dug the ferns out, sort of saved them, and then I thought, wow, maybe we should grow ferns. So it all started sort of from a loss of the ferns really.
And from there you started up a nursery and learned how to propagate ferns and how to grow them for people.
Yeah, I originally thought that I'd just buy some liners from the North Island. There was one lady at that stage growing ferns from spore, and she sort of ended up being a bit of a cot case, I suppose I'd say, and wouldn't sell me the ferns for some strange reason. So then I thought, well, like all of life, there seems to be a few obstacles get put up in front of us, and I decided I'd have to learn how to propagate them. And that was, and still is, it is, because they're predominantly grown from spore, it's an incredibly tricky process, and I have, and probably why you don't tend to see a lot of ferns spore propagated in the nursery business is because it is so difficult, and most of them sadly sort of pinching from Peter to pay Paul. Most ferns that are made for sale are often stolen out of the forest, dug up and dug out, and then repotted and grown on. And still is happening. Yes.
So tell us a bit about ferns. I mean, internationally, how many ferns are there? And in New Zealand, and I mean, they're quite a different sort of member of the plant family that a lot of us don't really understand. So tell us a bit about ferns.
It's a sort of an interesting thing, and I mean, look at even in New Zealand, we have people calling pungas, and there are no such thing as a punga. I mean, here we are in New Zealand where our silver fern is such a strong symbol, which is the ponga, but we call them pungas. So in some ways, our knowledge of ferns, even as a country in New Zealand, which is endowed of ferns for a temperate climate, is very low. So, I mean, ferns within an international sort of context, there's like 12,000 species of ferns on the planet at the moment. I mean, for the last 600 million years they've been here, so they are the first plants to form on this planet to start the green mantle. So 600 million years ago we were talking about 24/7 rain, which is, obviously a little bit difficult for a lot of things to survive in, but ferns developed this way where they could propagate with moisture. They didn't need flowers and they didn't need birds and wind. They needed the moisture, and they propagated and formed. So 600 million years ago, the whole planet was actually covered in ferns. And then hopefully Mr. Don Elder from Solid Energy is conscious of the fern matter, because that is actually what coal is. Coal actually comes from broken down fern matter.
All those millions of years ago.
From all those millions of years ago. So, and within that context, a lot of, as we see a lot of people who like our visitors and our tourists that come to New Zealand, they get spun out by those beautiful big tree ferns. And that's because they come from a temperate climate. And New Zealand, as a temperate base, we have a lot of temperate rainforest, and that is very unique in the planet. I never realised how special that actually is. But so we get those amazing, beautiful fauna and flora that is so unique because we have that sort of tropical sort of forest aspect to this country.
And so how many species of fern in New Zealand?
About 200. Approximately 200. And of that, there's about 9 different species of tree ferns. Which I think put New Zealand apart for a lot of travellers. When they walk the Abel Tasman National Park, or they go to the West Coast, or even here in New Zealand, even here in Canterbury, Canterbury has about 70 species of ferns, Canterbury and the Port Hills. And we just have to go for a short distance up to the Port Hills, and you can find Cythia smithii, Katoti, or Dicksonia sclerosus. You can go out to the peninsula and still find mamaku. I think there's one Dicksonia fibrosa left on the whole of Banks Peninsula, Hugh Wilson told me, which is pretty depressing, but
Banks Peninsula presumably would have been a huge haven for ferns when it was a forested landscape.
They talk, some of the old readings that you read are those initial guys that came into Akaroa Harbour. They talk of the tree ferns literally dripping off the coastal down into the ocean. So, I mean, look at it now. I mean, it's hard to imagine, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because they essentially stripped the flora and they became grass seed farms, I think, originally, which then grass seeded the whole of Canterbury Plains.
Yeah.
So in a way, as in the context of restoration, grass is probably the arch enemy.
Yeah. Yeah. So for a lot of people now who are wanting to recreate some of that we've lost, to try and get some of these ferns back into our landscape, and Canterbury in particular, but all around the country, what are some key things? What's some of the key things we need to think about as far as where we can grow ferns, what stage we do it in our restoration projects or in our garden? What's the key things we need to think about?
Ferns as a plant group are quite a unique thing, and when we often see them in the context, we look at them as an understory plant. Not that that is necessarily totally true, because we do see when you see a lot of slips happening around New Zealand, you see the first thing that comes back is things like Blechnum Nouveau-Zelandia, or they say in the North Island when the Maori burnt a lot of ground, the only reason why we've still got topsoil up there is because Pteridinium, the common bracken, actually completely covered the ground again and made a matrix which held the soil together, which stopped it being all washed off. So I mean, ferns can be, and they often are, a pioneer plant, but generally from a gardening point of view we think of them as the understory. So a good plants person is a person who puts the right plant in the right place. And often with ferns, it's particularly, we do have 70 species of ferns in Canterbury, which to most people you'd think of Canterbury as a dry, windswept zone, but places like Fendalton and some of these areas and a lot of Christchurch were very wetland orientated, and so we saw ferns like, can we just pull one of these in?
Great. Yep.
We see things like Blechnum minus, which was swamp Kio, which would have grown naturally all along the waterways and all along the streams with the flaxes. This is a very common fern that would have been here, and you still see it. I mean, you'd still actually, when you go out into the Canterbury Plains, you still see along the waterways, Blechnum minus is quite predominant. So I mean, this fern, if you were in a home context and you had a stream going through your home in Christchurch, you'd actually see Blechnum minus quite predominantly. So it needs a bit more moisture. Where some of the Asplenium lilae, if you were more of a coastal environment, like say that you're in Brighton or in these sorts of areas, Sumner, Asplenium lilae is a much hardier fern to the coastal environment. And the amazing thing about the Asplenium genus is that it can, once it's established, you can actually handle it very dry. So, people tend to think that ferns need a lot of moisture. And I mean, my response to that is often every plant needs a percentage of moisture. Without any moisture, the plant's going to die. But when people plant ferns, they must, and like any plant, you must, for the first season, you must keep an eye on it. Which sort of brings me to the point of probably one of the crucial things for success in ferns is getting the soil right.
So to tell us about the soil a bit, we'll have a look later at some soil outside and talk about it, but what are the key things about soil for ferns? What's the key element about soil? Can you just chuck it in anywhere in your back garden, or do you need to do some work with your soil to build it up first for your ferns? What's the requirements?
I think, Di, that it's probably the most important thing is to actually get the soil right. And not just so much, it's probably not so important, say, with some restoration hardier plants, pittosporums, these things that Kānuku, Mānuku, they can go into an environment and they can burrow their roots down. But when you look at the roots of a fern, they're quite a fibrous root system. So they're not they don't have a big heavy tap root. And so they need, it's, I always say when you walk through the forest, you're up in Omahu, up on the Port Hills, and you're walking through that forest, and there's just this incredible leaf litter. There's all those years. They say it takes 40,000 years to make 1 centimetre of topsoil. So, we've got to value this. This is a very important product, and the ferns need good organic matter-rich soil. So it's not so much, don't think so much about fertility. It's not so much throw a bit of Osmocote Blue or whatever these, fertilisers are on the ground. They need structure and texture, and so that's a matter of adding compost. I say if it's a very sandy soil, you've got to add more peat, more compost. If it's a very heavy soil, which probably predominantly a lot of Canterbury is, Oh, well, that's probably overgeneralisation. I mean, we've probably got quite skeletal soils, but you always need to add organic matter in the form of compost and peat. But you've also, if it's a heavier soil, you want to add some grit.
For the drainage.
For some drainage.
Yeah, okay.
And so what that gets is that gets oxygen.
Yep.
And plants need oxygen at their roots. If it's a very heavy, you can't wedge a hole around the back of your new section into some clay, because the developers stripped all the soil off and sold that, and all you're left with is some under sort of type of heavy structured soil. You can't wedge a hole in that, put the fern in, and expect it to grow, because it won't. It'll die.
So you're suggesting the first thing people should be doing is getting to know the soil of where they're wanting to plant and looking at what's there and perhaps what they need to build into it to get the right medium for the...
Absolutely. And that time invested in getting the soil right will mean that when you invest in the plants, you're going to get results. I mean, Muriel Fisher, who is still alive and well at about 90 plus, who was one of the great ladies of instillers of inspiring us in conservation, her thing was old cow manure. That's what she suggested. And I think it was something to do with the biodynamics and the gut of the cow creates a very good. But really, I mean, it's about, we say, get the texture and structure right and get maybe a handful of blood and bone. And then and then always make sure you put a good mulch on the top of it. So there's A, dealing with the soil, and then there's B, and by getting a mulch on the top of the ground, you're tending to stop the sunshine heating up the root system, because they like a cool root run.
Yep. So Paul, we were talking about soils a bit earlier on and about the important aspects of soils for growing fern, the organic matter, the drainage, the moisture. We've got a bit of soil here in front of us. Do you want to tell us something about it with regard to ferns?
Yeah, as I said before, it is probably the critical thing to get right first, and we've seen so many times planting jobs done and they just haven't put the effort and the time into doing the soil. I mean, obviously we get excited about getting the plants in the ground, and so we're sort of leaping forward to the end result. Some effort into the basis, and from a soil, I mean, if we looked at a soil like this and then we grab it like that and it falls apart, so it's probably saying there's not a great clay content there, and that's a good thing. It's friable, so it's got a percentage of oxygen in the soil, and we've got to look for getting some friability, some texture and structure of the soil. I mean, that is probably the most, I mean, it is important to have some. And by possibly adding something like peat, you're getting a high organic matter material. Remembering that peat is quite an acid, but generally ferns like a slightly acid soil. So that's generally not. But people will often ask about mushroom compost. Mushroom compost is quite alkaline. So by adding too much mushroom compost to an alkaline soil, which the ferns aren't going to like. Generally, the soil in the forest, I would imagine it would be around that sort of 5 and 6, 7 being neutral. So it's a slightly acid soil. So we've got to keep that into consideration.
So if someone's at home and they're looking at the soil and it's quite sticky and sort of clayey, you reckon peat would be the main thing you'd recommend for adding? If
it was a very sticky clay soil, they wedged a hole in the ground, poured some water in there, and it just filled up with water, and the water stayed there. Essentially, it would be like putting a child in there and it's drowning. It'd drown the roots of the plant. So if it was a clay soil, get some stone chip or get some sand, and also get maybe some old potting mix or something like a lot of the potting mixes these days are bark based. So you're getting the cambrian, the outer layer, and that is creating a bit of drainage for the chip. But definitely sand and grit. Sharp sand, builder's sand, which has got a mixture of particle sizes. Dig that in and get it working. But if on the opposite side, if you're in Brighton, it is a very sandy soil, you wouldn't have to worry about the sand, but you'd get into more of the composts and the peats. And but a bit of blood and bone. That's really all they need. I mean, a lot of it is about the soil and then about the environmental conditions. And you get those two running right, and they're actually very low maintenance plants. They don't get many diseases, they don't get many insect attacks. Aspleniums, one thing I could say there is aspleniums, slugs. Love aspleniums. So we had a bit of a garden tour come through as part of the Ellerslie to our property here in Christchurch, and sadly I hadn't got onto it about 2 months ago, and the aspleniums had just walked up the rashid and up the stipe and then chomped out all the fronds. So you had all these sort of half-eaten. So you've got to be, if you can stop the slugs, it helps with the aspleniums. But the soil is critical, and getting the soil right, I can't say more importantly, to get that right first. So, coming into a new area, you think you're putting ferns in the ground, maybe you're upper pruning a bit of the tree, the forest, you can get a bit of space underneath there, and then you'll be adding some organic matter and lightening the soil up. And generally, if you get a bit of a slope, it helps, because then you're actually getting a bit of air drainage. And then work on the soil, and maybe think, well, I'm going to plant ferns in 2 months' time, so let's do some to the soil now, let it settle down, and then we'll plant our ferns. And possibly with the advent of containerisation, you can really plant ferns and plants at any time of the year at these days. But probably the ideal time to plant ferns is either early autumn or early spring.
So similar to the other trees, you like to be planting in a restoration.
Absolutely. And some of them are hardier than others, obviously. We could probably put Pteridion in the middle of winter in a gravel pit, put a bit of glyphosate on it, and I think it'll probably carry on. But no, soil is the key. Get the soil right. Don't think too much about fertility. Think about texture and structure. And with those things right, generally they're very low key and pretty easy to grow. Well, Bleckner minus will actually grow in full sun as long as it's got moisture. Our trusty Wheki ponga, which is one of the 9 species of tree ferns we have in New Zealand, of the 700 in the world, it can grow in full sun. You see it in full sun. So it's not like every fern needs shade. They actually grow from the tops of the mountains down to the coastal environment over the whole world. But some, once again, it's getting the right plant.
So some will be more sensitive to frost perhaps, or to wind, or to too much light or not enough light, so it's sort of choosing the right fern for the right place. Absolutely,
Di, absolutely. That's a key part to it. Harking back to that, putting the right plant in the right place. And often we can see that and learn that by not just reading books, by actually getting out there and looking at these plants in their natural environment and seeing where they are growing. And then, my partner and I have done a lot of travelling up through the North Island collecting spore. And you come to these areas up in the North Island, and it's just paddock. It's just rolling paddock, all through that central part. And there'll be an area, and it'll be just like 15 or 20 big fibroses. I mean, we're talking, these things get trunks like this, 6 metres high, and obviously the farmer, and they'd be like 150 years old, and obviously the farmer just couldn't bring it to himself to kill them. So that's sort of the key or the cue to what was there. So they're growing out in full sun, being trampled around by cows. These things are incredibly hardy. Dicksonia fibrosa. The Dicksonia sclerosa, the Wheki, is probably the second hardiest tree ferns. And I suppose they're such a stunning. They make such a presence in some ways. The tree ferns in New Zealand.
They're certainly used quite a bit in people's on the landscape in their gardens now, aren't they? It's quite a statement in their garden for the tree fern to be there.
And there's sort of their awareness about using native plants. You'd have to say that the silver fern, the Cyathea dealbata, the true ponga, with its silver background, is so unique, aren't they? They're found nowhere else in the world, just unique to this climate. And I feel in some ways it's our duty to celebrate that local flora.
So if people are wanting to find out more about perhaps what ferns they should grow in their patch, how can they go about that? You've obviously built up knowledge over these last 20 or so years about which ones grow where and how to grow them. But how can other people who are more at the beginning of learning about ferns, how can they learn more about which plants to grow where?
There are some great books. The library, there's a lot of good books being written, some by Muriel Fisher, which is in a gardening context. There's some good technical data on all the species. We've got a website, www.fernfactor.co.nz, which has got some information on it. So, and that is possibly, that I see in the Westport Library in the stained glass window, it said, knowledge is power, which I think is, reading is obviously a good place to start. And Canterbury, strangely enough, is actually a very good environment to grow ferns. So don't be put off by the thought that you can't grow ferns in Canterbury. But, you know, when you obviously go to places like Auckland and the Waitakaris and these areas, they've got probably the biggest collection of ferns in the Waitakaris. And they've got the rainfall. But then, once again, that harks back to getting the soil right. I can't specify that.
Yeah, about the soil.
Getting the soil right, yes.
Yeah. And our own Peel Forest here in Canterbury has a great range of ferns too, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think Brian Malloy, didn't it?
Yeah.
The great Dr. Brian Malloy did a beautiful little book called Ferns of Peel Forest.
Yeah.
And I remember walking through the Peel Forest one time, and it's always fun when you see a plant for the first time and you identify it. You put the name to the plant.
Yeah.
And I can remember reading about Blechnum volcanicum, and it has a very triangulate frond shape, and just seeing that difference. It takes a wee while to get the eye in to start to see the difference, the subtlety between the Blechnum minus or the Blechnum NZ or the Blechnum volcanicum. And I remember that was in Peel Forest that I first saw the Blechnum volcanicum, which is one of our beautiful ferns.
So really encouraging people by the sound of it to get out there and have a look in their local environment and get to know what species are growing there, and perhaps using that as a basis for what else they can introduce into their areas. Absolutely.
And the Port Hills, possibly. I mean, Dean, we know our Dean's Bush that we have here has probably been rather devoid of fern species. But if we get, probably the closest area of quite stunning ferns would be up on the Port Hills and some of the reserves. Oamahu, and I think what is the man's name from Gamma Foundation has spoken on this program. I think he was speaking, or was he speaking today? And Oamahu is a beautiful, just stunning ferns, and that's like 30 minutes, 25 minutes drive from Central Christchurch. You're up onto the Port Hills and you're in tree ferns and you're in beautiful lush ground ferns and plus all the other fauna and flora that are up there. So I would definitely recommend. They're a little bit trickier. You've got to treat ferns with a little bit more care and attention to get them established. People possibly in the past have been a little bit, they bypass ferns because they get a bit freaked out by the names, particularly the botanical names, so they don't relate to the names. And then and then the next thing is that they don't know the names, and then they look over them, and they think they're very difficult, and they tend to be a little bit more expensive to buy, which is to do with their propagation and their time. We're talking about 2 years to propagate that from spore, possibly 3 years for something like this. So that's time. Time is money. You know how it is, Di.
Great. So, Paul, you were talking before about bracken in the North Island and how important it was in holding down the soil after the big fires.
Yes.
And I noticed too you've got a lovely Pteridium brooch here on your chest. And so I was wondering if you've got any thoughts about the use of bracken, the use of Pteridium in restoration, and the natural role of providing a shelter for other plants to come through and to hold that soil in place.
I've sort of, over the years, trying to move more from a garden centre provider to more looking at ferns in a restoration context, and it's been quite difficult in respect, as I said before, they take quite some time to grow, so then they've got to be quite expensive. And then restoration grade plants are generally in that sort of $2.50, $3 category, and it's pretty difficult to produce a plant in that price sort of bracket. So looking at bracken, Pteridium esculentum, which is a worldwide species. I think it is probably the most common fern on the whole world. It's growing all around the planet and has been used. And if you search Pteridium on Google, essentially all the information is about killing it, and they're trying to get rid of it, particularly in places like in England, where they see it as a problem. But after talking to people like Hugh Wilson and Colin Merck and discussing the idea, I mean, we often are confronted with in a situation where there's big earth movement and big development going on. I mean, one context that came up to mind was CPW, the Canterbury Plains Water Scheme. They're looking at putting many kilometres of waterways through the Canterbury Plains, and then they were looking at the context of how could we actually we could use those as a green corridor. So those waterways could become a path as a green corridor, but then 10,000, what are we talking, 10,000 plants per hectare, $100,000 maybe to restore a hectare of ground. So that's an expensive process that a trust or an organisation like CPW definitely shy away from, and would probably just let it go in grass. But if we could develop a system where we could get pteridine growing and maybe look at mechanically planting it, we could get they talk about 900 plants an hour, 900 plants a day, a good plantable plant. If you put a mechanical plant, you can put about 4,000 to 10,000 plants in a day if the ground's right. So we're sort of looking at this idea of growing pteridine and getting it into the ground, and then essentially what it does, the unique thing about pteridine is it has an underground creeping rhizome, and so because that rhizome is growing underground, it can handle any weather. You know, it can handle my partner and I were up in Wanaka, up on the sides of the mountains, literally on the sides of the mountains, and that's really what's holding those hills together. It is the pteridine, and the farmers burn it, and then it all sprouts away again, and then and then so they get a bit of, I suppose the potassium goes into the ground, they get a bit of shot of the grass, but then the pteridine, the incredible thing about pteridine is that it actually outcompetes grass. You know, you can see patches of pteridine by the railway lines, and there'll be a patch of them, and then slowly it's coming out, and where there's few plants, that will outcompete grass. So I see great potential for looking at pteridine as a base plant, creates a ground cover, stops losing the soil, and then it entices apparently it's the spiders and the ants. So you're getting that insect thing happening, which then you're getting the bird thing happening, and then you're getting, hopefully, maybe you'd plant a sea of pteridine, and in a group you'd plant a group of very coprosmas and high seeding plants, and then forget about it. You know, and then just let maybe 30 years, maybe 50 years, maybe 100 years, the ground's locked up. It's not going to get, because if you go out into a paddock and you forgot about a paddock of grass in the Canterbury Plains, 50, 100, 200 years later it'll be just grass, I would say. But you know, if you're talking to Hugh over in Hinawai, the pteridine, he says the native plants literally jump out of the pteridine. So I'm quite excited about the idea of producing a lot of bracken.
Yeah.
For some strange reason.
Yeah. Very exciting. Watch the space, I'd say.
Watch the space. And also, not just, there's bracken, there's Pasia up in the North Island, Pasia scabula, which is the scented fern, a beautiful fern. Once again, the farmers hate Pasia. But, you know, I think it's got a place to play in restoration. And Hyperlepis in some of the more wetter places. And it's just a matter of, with new things, it's a matter of getting some experiments in, trying to do some trial plots and starting getting some data and then presenting it and trying getting some of the people to take the idea up. So the first thing is obviously we've got to produce pteridine. Yeah. And that's no easy task, but it's we're a wee way along that track. So I'm quite excited about the use of it. And looking at pteridine, I mean, a lot of people look at it as quite an ugly plant, but when you really look at pteridine, it's quite a stunning plant. You know, it's a beautiful, the koru comes up and the way it forms, and it was used a lot in the past. The Maori used to eat it. It was actually, they cultivated it to get the rhizome to eat. So it's had a lot of uses over the past, and I think as a restoration context, I mean, it's a lot easier, and we must always remember it's a lot easier to look after what we've already got. You know, that's got to be the paramount first in conservation. But the next thing is if we as humans are going to make changes on the planet of the Earth, I think we're all realising now that one thing is not disconnected to the other thing. You know, if we're going to actually take the forest off or do major land changes, we need to put things back there to mitigate some of these effects. And restoration's an expensive thing, and Solid Energy here at Ellerslie, I think, of commenting and making words about their effort that they're putting back for their restoration, and so they're being socially responsible, and hopefully through things like the RMA and good discourse, a democratic society will see more restoration, but it is expensive. has got a big cost. So I'm pretty excited about growing a lot of Teridium.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And Teridium is what a lot of the farmers down in Otago would call pig fern, isn't it?
Absolutely.
It's pig fern. Yeah.
There's a lot of sort of funny common names that people put on plants, and often people ask me, what's the foxtail fern? And I always say to them, well, I need a botanical name. We need a botanical name. And probably I'd imagine around the world Teridium has probably been given a lot of
names. Yeah.
Probably not too becoming.
Yeah.
They're probably giving it a wee bit of a hard time. But it has got a lot of interesting qualities, Teridium esculentum, and I think we need to look to nature for some of the answers. And if we look at the hardiness of this plant, and often in big restoration jobs around New Zealand, you'd probably say there's a small palette of plants that they use initially, and Manuka, Carnuka, Pitos, Alerias, these plants. But when you're putting one per square metre, and there's 10,000 square metres per hectare, and that one has got to be looked after, it's got to be maintained, and in Canterbury you've probably got to build in the watering aspect. Where our nursery is out on the Canterbury Plains, we were watering Plagianthus regius. They must have been 1.5 metres high, and if we hadn't watered them, probably last summer they would have died. So watering is and also the beautiful thing about Teridium is rabbits don't eat it.
That's critical.
So that's a big plus, because that's another one of the things that you're battling all the time.
That's right. Yeah.
And rabbits and hares.
What about possums?
Don't think possum. I'm pretty sure possums don't eat as well. I mean, there are some points of Teridium that on the face of it probably don't look so flash, but I won't tend to mention those at this present moment.
So coming back to the other ferns, we've got a few of the examples of ferns here, and like you say, people get a bit bamboozled trying to identify them. It can just seem like there's a mess of ferns out there, and they've got these amazing Latin names. But maybe we could just go through a few key ones here and just talk through what the key thing about identifying them are and what genus and species they're from.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you said, Di, that is and possibly I think that's why ferns have struggled a wee bit out there to get a bit of ground and people's using them and putting them in their gardens, is because their names are a bit complex, and also because they're sort of under the radar, I suppose. And they don't flower.
Yeah.
No flowers, not a flower to be seen. It's not Ellerslie Flower Show, it's Ellerslie Fern Show. I think I might have to talk to Bob about that. Maybe a wee bit of a change of pace here. But this is Pelea rotundifolia. We have 3 species, I think, within that genus in New Zealand. You could write me on that one. There's Pelea rotundifolia, Pelea falcata, and then there's this wee mountain one, I think, coloured. But it's generally creeping rhizome. They creep and form a wee group over time, and don't get too tall. The pinny, the wee bit here is called the pinny. That is quite distinctive, and people are quite attracted to the round shape, which makes it quite attractive. Very good indoor plant as much as an outdoor plant, which is the key to say that it is can handle a bit of dry air.
Yep, and it grows here in
that's a local Canterbury fern. And then we've got the genus Asplenium, which is many Aspleniums species within this genus. Generally tend to be of this beautiful shininess. You can sort of see by the texture of them that they're quite good by coastal. These get a bit larger, a bit more upright than the Pelea. They don't creep, they don't have a creeping rhizome. Spore on the back, we can probably just see a wee bit of spore there for me. This is spore collection time at the present moment. Beautiful fern. Frost. A lot of ferns, you do have to be careful about the frost in the first season. They're on the ground. Frosts tend to lie in low areas. You've got to look, on a bit of sloping ground, better than a frost pocket, until you've got some protection overhead. Asplenium oblongifolium, this shining spleenwort, is probably the more common. This is Asplenium lili, the coastal spleenwort. I mean, it's a bit of a strange name, isn't it? Spleenwort. Where does that come from?
And these are the ones you sometimes see in the forest growing on trees. I mean, is there any chance for people to create that in their own garden?
Absolutely. I think they are. You do see them as epiphytes. Once again, a cue to the situation where they can grow in quite dry environments. There's the Splenium nidus, isn't it? The bird's nest fern, which is the Australian one, which I've seen actually growing as an epiphyte overseas. And you do see this more up in Waitakaris, up in the North Island. I've seen it as an epiphytic fern. So you definitely die. You could probably lash a bit of outer husk from a palm, get a bit of soil onto it, and then over time that will lodge itself into a tree. I mean, that is a good use. I mean, is it the Blechnum filiforme, which is the lovely creeping, and you see it as a big ground cover up in the North Island, and then as it goes up the actual tree, it changes its form. Which is quite a bit like the Pseudopanix crassifolium, you get the changing form, and ferns do that as well. We've got the Wheki ponga. I mean, there's Wheki, there's ponga, and there's Wheki ponga. 3 different Maori names for 3 different ferns. Slightly confusing. People get a bit freaked out by it. But this is the Wheki ponga, which we talked about before, the very hardy, very big tree fern. Within 3 years, you'd probably get a 2 metre by 2 metre. So I'm saying to people, don't think so much vertical, think more horizontal. They're more horizontal. So you're getting a big horizontal space, and then their trunks grow about 100 millimetres a year, but they've got a big top on them. So you're not getting so much vertical, but you're getting a big spread on it. And a beautiful, beautiful tree fern, stunning. You get in a spring day and you see 25 new koru coming out of this.
Here now, can't you?
Just in there. I mean, a strong symbol in New Zealand, used in Maori carving and all sorts of examples. It's sort of a new life, isn't it? That's what it's really saying. So you don't have to get too concerned about if the frond of your tree fern, as we can see out in the garden behind us in the forest, are burning and dying down. You just whip them off their secateurs and the new ones will come up. So it's not like a tree of a branch. When you're chopping off, it's not going to necessarily grow as quickly back again. And then this is the Blechnum minus, which we spoke about before, the wetland fern. What makes Blechnum quite unique is they have their own separate fertile fronds. And we can see that there. That is a whole different mechanism to create the spore. So it's not like in the Asplenium we saw on the back of the frond, we saw spore, but in the Blechnum we have a whole separate fertile frond. So all Blechnums, which is many species in that genus, they all have the separate fertile frond. And there's nothing wrong with it. I have had people ring me up and said, my Blechnum's doing all these weird things, and then I've visited these people and they've actually just got the secateurs and gone, woof! Because they think there's some sort of disease problem with it. It's reproducing. Where it's actually reproducing, which is a pretty essential part of all living organisms. So this has, and from it, you must realise, from one sporangii case, which, if we looked in one wee piece like this, there's probably 500 sporangii cases. And from every case, there's 64 spore. So there may be 30,000 spore in here. So when we looked at this thing might be producing, 500,000 spore. So they're very prolific. They sort of basically have sex with themselves, and then they grow a new fern. So it's probably something to be said. They've been around for 600 million years.
Another thing or two, don't they?
And they've got it pretty sussed. So it's nice to think about these. And then finally, we've just in our wee display here, we've got. This is the Wheki. So we said that was Wheki, this is Wheki ponga. And this is now, the Maori name is just Wheki, Dicksonia squarosa. Another very hardy, probably the most common tree fern in New Zealand. It is actually the only tree fern in the world where when it gets damaged at the top, which is what's happened to this one, it'll sprout out from the bottom. And when you go into a bit of established forest, you'll often see Wheki as a sort of, you'll see the mother plant, and then you'll see, and it's just like a non-running bamboo. And that is the only tree fern out of the 700 species that actually does that. So it is quite, like a lot of our flora and fauna in this country. It is, unique and endemic and found nowhere else in the world. So, I mean, a lot of people are probably attracted to tree ferns, and then once their interest in tree ferns is sort of grabbed, they then look to the other ferns.
Fantastic. And you're a specialist grower of these ferns and obviously collect the spore and create the plants. Is it something that people can do in their own restoration, is to actually propagate their own ferns, or is it really quite a specialist task?
I suppose, Di, after 15 years of grinding away at this little process, I would say it is very much a specialist task. I mean, some of the ferns can be grown from vegetative pieces. Some of them do have bulbils. And so there is a few of the species that can be vegetatively grown, but generally we don't want people to go into the forest and dig them out. So it needs to be done by a specialist in a specialist context. Yeah.
Fantastic, Paul. It's been wonderful.
Cool.
Thanks for your time.
Yeah, cheers.
Thanks for being part of Bush Telly.
Yeah, great.
Lovely.
Nice to be here.